Leonardo da Vinci wasn't just a painter or an inventor, he was a master of capturing the chaos of curiosity on paper. Across his lifetime, he filled over 7,000 pages of notebooks with sketches, questions, and plans that spanned the breadth of human imagination. From the curve of a bird's wing to the mechanics of a war machine, his scribbles wove together art, science, and wonder. These weren't mere doodles, they were the scaffolding of a mind that turned fleeting thoughts into timeless breakthroughs. Today, we can borrow from his method, not just to marvel at his genius, but to tame our own busy lives with a to-do list like no other. Born in 1452 in a quiet Tuscan village, Leonardo grew up surrounded by rolling hills and restless streams, nature's own classroom. His father, a notary, and his mother, a peasant woman, never married, leaving him free from the rigid path of a scholar's life. Instead of memorizing Latin texts, he watched the world. As a boy, he'd sit by the riverbank, sketching the way water twisted around rocks, or climb a tree to study a hawk's flight. These early habits stuck with him. Every observation became a question, every question a task. "How does a fish glide?" he'd write, or "What makes a shadow bend?" His notebooks became a mirror of his mind, a place where no idea was too small to explore. What drove Leonardo wasn't duty. It was a hunger to understand. Take his fascination with flight. He didn't just dream of soaring. He dissected birds to map their bones, sketched wings that flapped like theirs, and listed steps to test his ideas. One page might read, "Measure the span of a falcon's wing," followed by, "Craft a frame of wood and silk." Another day, he'd pivot to water, noting, "Study the swirl of a stream. Can it power a wheel?" His lists weren't rigid checklists. They were living threads of curiosity, pulling him from one discovery to the next. This fluidity made him a genius, and sometimes a scatterbrain, leaving half-finished projects in his wake. In his teens, Leonardo moved to Florence, a city alive with artisans and thinkers. His father apprenticed him to Andrea del Verrocchio, a sculptor and painter whose workshop buzzed with creativity. Here, Leonardo's note-taking took shape. While grinding pigments or chiseling stone, he'd jot down tasks, mix a softer blue for the sky, or observe how veins show through skin. Verrocchio's statue of a youth, its muscles taut and lifelike, inspired him to sketch bodies in motion, lists of poses piling up beside his drawings. He didn't just work, he questioned every stroke, every shadow, turning routine into revelation. His lists grew wilder as his interests expanded. By his 20s, he was filling pages with ideas that leapt across disciplines. One day he'd write, "Design a bridge that sways with the wind." Then, "Examine the tongue of a woodpecker. How does it curl?" The next he'd plan, "Build a lens to see the stars closer." These weren't idle musings. Each task sparked experiments. He'd haul wood to test a structure, chase birds to mimic their flight, or grind glass to peer at the heavens. His notebooks, written in his quirky mirrored script, became a labyrinth of ambition, a to-do list that doubled as a map of the possible. But Leonardo's method wasn't flawless. His curiosity often outran his focus. In Florence, he opened his own studio at 25, brimming with commissions, yet many canvases stayed blank. A client might ask for a portrait only to find Leonardo sketching a water pump instead, his list reading, "Test a pipe to lift the Arno." Friends called him a dreamer, patrons grew impatient. Still, his chaos bore fruit. Those scattered notes on anatomy, machines, light laid the groundwork for wonders like the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. His trick was persistence. Even unfinished, every task fed the next. How can we steal from Leonardo's playbook? Start with wonder. His lists began with questions, not orders. Instead of buy groceries, he'd write, "What spices wake the tongue?" Then chase the answer. Try it. Next time you're stuck, ask, "What's the smallest step I can take?" Jot it down. Maybe it's sketch a rough idea or find one fact. Let curiosity pull you forward. Second, mix the big with the small. Leonardo paired invent a flying device with sharpen my quill, grand dreams beside daily grit. Your list might say, launch a project next to clear my desk. Both matter. By his 30s, Leonardo's reputation as a polymath caught the eye of Lorenzo de' Medici, Florence's ruler. Sent to Milan in 1482 with a lyre he'd built himself, he pitched more than music to Duke Ludovico Sforza. His letter, part resume, part to-do list, promised war machines, canals, and sculptures, with painting tacked on like an afterthought. Construct a tank with hidden wheels, he wrote, then design a dome to crown the cathedral. The Duke, a pragmatist with an eye for flair, hired him on the spot. Milan would become Leonardo's proving ground, where his lists turned into legacies. In Milan, his note-taking hit a new stride. Tasked with engineering marvels, he'd scribble, map the flow of the Po River, then pivot to art with blend a shadow for a saint's robe. His days were a whirlwind, consulting on bridges 1 hour, sketching a horse statue the next. His lists kept him anchored, a thread through the storm of his mind. One page might plan, measure the cathedral's arches. Beside, study a corpse's heart. How does it pump? He'd lug tools to a building site, then sneak to a crypt to dissect, each task fueling his dual love of structure and flesh. Leonardo's Milanese lists weren't just for him, they were a dialogue with the world. He'd note, ask the smith how iron bends, or watch the fisher's nets. Can they lift more? He learned from others, weaving their insights into his plans. You can too. Add, talk to a friend about this idea to your list. Collaboration sharpens vision. And he never stopped refining. A crossed-off task like test a pulley might reappear as test it with heavier stone. Failure wasn't the end. It was a detour to something better. As he settled into Milan, Leonardo's notebooks swelled with dreams. He sketched a city rebuilt with canals, listing, dig a channel to drain the swamp, then mused, could it power a mill? He pondered war, writing, forge a crossbow that shoots twice, and nature with trace the crocodile's jaw. Why so strong? Each line was a seed, some sprouting into reality, others waiting for centuries to bloom. His to-do lists weren't about finishing, they were about starting, about keeping the fire of wonder alive. This first chapter of Leonardo's story ends here, in Milan, where his lists began to shape a legacy. Part 2 will dive into how those scribbles birthed masterpieces like The Last Supper, fueled his final years in France, and left us a blueprint to live more curiously today. For now, grab a pen. Ask yourself, what's one thing I've always wanted to figure out? Write it down. That's where Leonardo would start. And it's where you can too. In Milan, Leonardo da Vinci's life was a tapestry of ink and ambition. Under Duke Ludovico Sforza's patronage, his notebooks became a whirlwind of tasks that danced between art and invention. By 1495, one entry stood out. Paint a scene of Christ's final meal. This wasn't just another commission. It was a chance to fuse his love of motion, emotion, and discovery. into a single wall. What emerged was The Last Supper, a mural in a quiet Milanese monastery that would echo through centuries. His to-do list for it was as alive as the painting itself. Sketch 12 figures in turmoil. Find a vanishing point for the eye. Mix a plaster to hold the colors. Leonardo's genius shone in the details. He chose the moment Jesus reveals a traitor among his disciples, and his list unfolded the drama. Pose one with hands flung wide, shock. Darken another's face, guilt. He scratched out, test sharp lines, replacing it with blend edges soft like smoke. That blurring, his signature sfumato, breathed life into the figures, making them pulse with feeling. He hammered a nail into the wall, noting, draw lines from here to guide the gaze, crafting a perspective that locked every eye on Christ. His days swung between frenzy and stillness, hours of painting followed by hours of staring, refining, rethinking. But Milan demanded more than art. His lists juggled the Duke's whims. Forge a bronze horse tall as a tower sat beside, strengthen the city's walls. The horse, a monument to Ludovico's father, consumed him. He wrote, study a steed's stance, then mold clay to match its curve. A massive model rose, only to fall when war loomed in 1499. Melt bronze for cannons, the Duke ordered, and Leonardo's list shifted. Save what sketches I can. French invaders toppled his clay creation, but his notes endured, seeds of ideas that refused to die. When Ludovico's rule crumbled, Leonardo, nearing 50, became a wanderer again. His notebooks traveled with him, filling with tasks that mirrored his restless spirit. In Venice he scribbled, design a dam to flood the enemy, then map the tides. How do they pull? In Florence, he returned to art, listing paint a battle's chaos, birthing a mural of clashing soldiers that stunned onlookers, though, true to form, he left it half done, distracted by build a lens to magnify the moon. His lists were a lifeline, tethering his sprawling mind to the world. In 1502, Cesare Borgia, a warlord with a ruthless edge, hired him as an engineer. Leonardo's to-do list turned martial. Sketch a fortress no arrow can pierce. Measure Imola's streets for a map. That map, drawn with a compass and a steady hand, wasn't just lines on paper. It was a weapon, guiding Borgia's conquests with eerie precision. Yet even amid war, he paused to note, watch a hawk dive. What lifts it after? His curiosity never bowed to circumstance. It thrived in the cracks between duties. By 1516, Leonardo's fame drew a new admirer, King Francis I of France. At 64, he crossed the Alps to the Loire Valley, settling in a manor bathed in golden light. His lists softened here, reflecting a man wrestling with time. Finish her smile, he wrote, cradling a portrait he'd carried for years, the Mona Lisa. This wasn't a task rushed to completion. It was a slow burn of perfection. His notes read, shade her eyes to follow, curve her lips, faint but alive. He'd layer a task like test oil for glow, with recall how dusk softens a face, marrying science to soul. The Mona Lisa became his quiet triumph. His list tracked every breakthrough, blur the jaw, hide the edge, or tilt her gaze. What does it say? That smile, shifting with the viewer's angle, was no accident. He'd studied how eyes trick the mind, noting, test a shadow's shift in dim light. Beside it, he'd muse, why do rivers bend? Proof his wonder never dimmed. In France, his tasks grew introspective. Draw water breaking the earth, sketching floods that mirrored his own mortality. Leonardo's health waned by 1519, At 67, a trembling hand, perhaps from a stroke, slowed his pen, but not his thoughts. His final list included "Sort my pages" and a humble "Give thanks." On May 2nd, he died in his manor, leaving his notebooks and the Mona Lisa to the world. Those pages, over 7,000, weren't just a record. They were a method, a way to wrestle with life's vastness. Describe the crocodile strength he'd written decades before, a task unanswered but alive in ink, a spark for someone else to chase. His lists bridged art and science like nothing else. Cut a heart, see its chambers, led to drawings that rewrote medicine. Build a wing, test its lift, fueled dreams of flight centuries ahead of their time. He didn't finish everything. Half his tasks stayed crossed out or abandoned, but that wasn't the point. Each line was a step, a question, a dare. Self-taught, he turned observation into mastery, listing, "Watch the stars move," then proving they did. His legacy isn't just what he made, it's how he thought. So how do we list like Leonardo today? Part 1 gave us the start. Begin with wonder. Mix big dreams with small steps. Now, add depth. His tasks weren't static. He'd revisit them, writing, "Retry a pulley, stronger rope." Don't just check boxes, evolve them. If "write a story" stalls, shift it to "find one line that sings." Next, embrace the mess. Leonardo's pages spilled with tangents. Study a flower's veins beside "fix a canal's leak." Your list can too. Plan a trip next to "doodle a tree." Chaos breeds breakthroughs. Finally, share the load. He'd note, "Ask the mason how stone cracks," pulling wisdom from others. Add, "Call someone who's done this" to your list. It's not cheating, it's collaboration. And keep it alive. Cross off "bake a cake," then add, "bake it better." Leonardo's lists weren't about ending, they were about beginning again. His life proves it. From a boy sketching streams to a sage painting smiles, he never stopped asking, "What next?" Picture this: a desk strewn with papers, a quill scratching, "Measure the wind's push." That was Leonardo in Milan, dreaming of flight. Later in France, it's a frail hand noting, "Soften her cheeks' glow," perfecting the Mona Lisa. His lists tied it all together: art, science, wonder. Today, they're a gift. Grab a notebook. Write, "What's one mystery I can chase?" Maybe it's, "How does sound bend?" Or, "What grows in my yard?" Start there. Let it grow. If Leonardo's method sparks you, there's a modern twist. Tools like Brilliant turn curiosity into action, breaking math, science, even AI into bite-sized tasks you can tackle. I've been hooked on their logic puzzles. 15 minutes a day listing, solve one more. Their course on flight mechanics feels like Leonardo's wing sketches come alive. Try it free for 30 days at brilliant.org/newsthink-link below and get 20% off a year if you stay. It's his spirit in your pocket. Ask, explore, list, repeat. From a Tuscan village to a French manor, Leonardo da Vinci lived by his lists. They birthed the Last Supper's grace, the Mona Lisa's gaze, and ideas that still soar. He wasn't perfect. Tasks piled up, projects faded, but he was relentless. His lesson? Write it down, chase it, change it. That's how a curious mind becomes a life-changing one. For Newsthink, I'm Cindy Palm. Thanks for sticking with me.